Good afternoon and welcome to First Friday at the International Quilt Museum. We're coming to you from quarantine. I'm Sarah Walcott. I'm the collections manager at the International Quilt Museum. And we thought, in the spirit of the times, a little talk about domesticity and madness was in order. So today we're going to talk about crazy quilts and mad women and quilting in the age of Freudian hysteria. Today, as I mentioned, we're going to talk about crazy quilts and mad women. These two social trends kind of arose at the same time. And so I believe there's definitely a connection there. So we're just going to explore that a little bit today. So to explore this, we have to go back in time a little ways to the cult of domesticity, which really arose out of the Industrial Revolution. Kind of a response to that, people started kind of going inward, kind of seeing the home as a place to really feel safe and connected to their families in an age of a lot of huge societal and economic changes, as well as a lot of mechanization of a lot of things that had been done by hand labor previously. So the cult of domesticity refers to this ideal of womanhood. And I'm just going to quote a famous essay by Barbara Welter, The Cult of True Womanhood, 1820 to 1860. And this is how she defines true womanhood. The attributes of true womanhood, by which a woman judged herself and was judged by her husband, her neighbors, and society, could be divided into four cardinal virtues: piety, purity, submissiveness, and domesticity. Put them all together and they spelled mother, daughter, sister, wife, woman. Without them, no matter whether there was fame, achievement, or wealth, all was ashes. With them, she was promised happiness and power. Whether she got happiness and power is another question. So in response to this came about something called the New Woman, which is kind of this ideal of a woman who pushes back against the cult of domesticity, someone who is interested in travel, very, very interested in education, not interested in what society thinks she should be doing or wearing or caring about. And so this portrait is Frances Benjamin Johnson's self-portrait as New Woman from 1896. And she's just kind of illustrating, as you can see, her skirts are pulled up, she's smoking, she's got a beer stein in her hand, she just doesn't care. And that is a big threat to the status quo. So now we need to travel even a little further back in time to talk about the origins of these ideas of female madness, hysteria, and the wandering womb. So Hippocrates is the person credited with coming up with this concept of the wandering womb, which is exactly what it sounds like. The Greeks believed that the uterus was kind of this free-floating entity within the body with almost a mind of its own. They called it the animal within the animal, very reminiscent of Freud's mind within a mind, thousands of years later. And so they believed that all kinds of physical, emotional, and mental maladies resulted from the ability of the uterus to kind of move about the body. And so the cure for this was to get married and have children. And so unfortunately, these ideas stayed pretty popular for a very long time. Science obviously advanced to the point that experts were aware that the uterus couldn't move around the body. Nevertheless, they still attributed many, many, many normal experiences that women had to some kind of disease process or some kind of mental illness, when instead it's entirely possible that their distress was simply caused by staying inside all day, doing nothing but housework, as I'm sure many of us can understand right now. So in 1603, the first English book on hysteria was published by Edward Jordan, and he stated that maidens and widows were most subject to hysteria. So really bringing this idea several thousand years forward that the cure for all that ails women is to be married and childbearing. And he wasn't a totally bad dude. He represented a lot of women who were accused of witchcraft by trying to say they're not doing anything supernatural, their uterus is just controlling them, with mixed success. I do appreciate the effort. So this painting in the background here is a clinical lesson at the Salpêtrière. It is a famous 1887 painting depicting this woman in the posture of hysteria, and this huge group of men, many of whom I've blocked out with my title there, sorry. But they're all looking at her in her underclothing in this posture of kind of vulnerability and discontent, and just it's obvious that she is suffering something. He would be accused later of faking a lot of this, which is not really a surprise, that if you gather a whole bunch of people together, you probably have to stage the reactions in order to get the desired effect. Especially with something like hysteria, you can't really do it on command. But nevertheless, women were being diagnosed with hysteria left and right, especially wealthy white women. This definitely has a class element to it that we can't ignore, as do the creation of crazy quilts themselves. So crazy quilts became really, really popular in the last quarter of the 19th century as a decorative art. And you can see here the scan is taken from Crazy Quilts by Penny McMorris. And this is embroidery stitch patterns and crazy patchwork instructions from the E.M. Limery Company in 1897. So if you look closely at these, I'll just ask you to note these flowers, the spider webs, the beetles, the stars, the interlocking rings, and there's a strange little moon face up there too. All of these we'll see again, along with many, many, many of these decorative stitches. So these were not something that people were just coming up with necessarily on their own. There were instructions being published. There were bags of scraps being sold so that women could create quilts with a huge variety of silks, satins, velvets without having to source all of those individually on their own. This was a pretty big industry at the time. And I'd also just like to point out that this idea that I'm putting forth, that there is a connection between the ideas in women's mental and emotional health of the day and crazy quilts, is not just I'm not just hazarding a guess. I am basing this on primary sources. I'll get to some more later, but there are many, many, many references that conflate women's mental health and emotional health with the process of making a crazy quilt. Not even the finished project, but something about the process of choosing to create this seems to have been really interesting for people. So this slide is also taken from Penny McMorris's Crazy Quilts, which is an incredible reference. And this is a postcard sent in 1911 to Miss Minnie Heald of Davenport, Iowa. I'm making a crazy quilt and I want your face for the center. So that kind of speaks for itself. So now I'd like to get into the critics of crazy quilts. And for this, I'm going to reference Sue Reich's Crazy as a Bed Quilt, which is another really amazing resource. And I highly recommend you pick it up. So something that I've noticed in reading through this book is that criticisms tend to fall into two somewhat overlapping categories. And there are so many criticisms of crazy quilts and women who made them. But these categories are either that by making a crazy quilt, a woman in some way violated one of the four tenets of true womanhood: purity, piety, submissiveness, and domesticity, or that she in some way is doing a disservice to herself and her gender by creating one in the first place, even though a huge chunk of society is telling her that this is what she is supposed to be doing and this is a creative outlet for her. So kind of concern trolling. So I'll start with a few quotes from primary sources on the sort of violation of true womanhood side. Okay, so this is from the Indiana Weekly Messenger, Indiana, Pennsylvania, February 4th, 1884. A Jersey City girl is at work on a crazy quilt composed of small pieces clipped from the silk linings of her many admirers' overcoats. The Trenton Times, Trenton, New Jersey, February 8, 1884. An Indiana editor was sued for breach of promise, but when he explained that the girl had a mania for making scrap quilts, the court excused him and imposed the cost on the plaintiff. Bucks County Gazette, Bristol, Pennsylvania, September 18, 1884. Philadelphia young ladies assiduously collect silken cravats from their gentlemen friends, and one young woman is reported to have a quilt in which every one of the 800 or 900 pieces has at one time or other formed part of the necktie of some one of her gentleman acquaintances. Olean Democrat, Olean, New York, November 11, 1884. Can a mother forget her child? Well, she did at Fultonville, New York the other day when her house was afire and she happened to think that her favorite crazy quilt was endangered. She rushed in and rescued it, but forgot the baby, which, we are glad to say, was saved by a fireman whose mind was not occupied with crazy quilts. The Mountain Democrat, Placerville, California, December 13th, 1890. Women criminals incurable. A partial explanation of the strange state of things may be found in the fact that women are more thoroughgoing in all things, good, bad, or indifferent, than men are. They do nothing by halves. Be the matter the construction of a shortcake, the making of a crazy quilt, or the poisoning of a rival, she devotes all her time, knowledge, and talents to it. So many of those, especially the woman with 800 or 900 suitors and the other woman who allegedly was ready to let her baby burn in order to save her crazy quilt, seem to be based on incredibly limited fact and ought to be taken with a large grain of salt, which means that it was a way to put forward the idea that women who devoted this kind of time to an artistic and aesthetic pursuit were somehow to be shamed. They were obviously fulfilling their domestic duties. However, they had to find something else to shame them for. And it's not a coincidence that so many of these relate to young men's cravats, young men's ties, young men's linings of their hats. A lot of writers of the day were very concerned with this kind of mania and lust that women had for crazy quilt fabrics, which ties in really directly, I feel, to this kind of belief that in order for women to settle down and not be hysterical, they needed to be married mothers. Crazy quilts, it seems to me, were almost a symbol of this sort of discontent. And when we start to look at them more closely, it won't be hard to see why. So going into that second set of criticisms, this kind of concern trolling. So this, I think, is a little tongue-in-cheek, but nevertheless, it's so derisive that it's impossible not to take it a little bit seriously. So this is from the Fort Wayne Gazette, Fort Wayne, Indiana, March 30th, 1884. Fancy work is the small vice of the female sex. It is to women what smoking is to men. In some respects, it is worse indeed, for a man can read or write and smoke at the same time. Fancy work, on the contrary, is so absorbing as an intellectual exercise that it is not possible for a woman to make the Kensington stitch and do anything else unless it is to gossip. In brief, we arraign female fancy work as a waster of time, a destroyer of eyesight and health, a deadener to all nobler ambitions, and a promoter of scandal besides. We shall prove it. So they go on and on to talk about how terrible fancy work is. And they conclude with this. We arraign fancy work because it dwarfs women's intellects. It gives them just occupation enough to make them believe they are doing something. They sit and moon over their 1, 2, 3 cross stitch till the practical interests of life fade from their mental horizon. They are the true hashish eaters. Fancy work is a genuine deadening drug, cheating ladies into a fool's paradise. And I think it's really interesting, their reference to hashish. So many of these women, probably many of the women who were creating crazy quilts, were also being prescribed opiates in huge amounts to cope with their hysteria or to treat their hysteria. And so I think that's an influence that we really can't ignore upon the creation of these quilts, and certainly upon the culture in which they were created. That wealthy white women diagnosed in huge numbers with hysteria and prescribed opiates were turning to this very tactile pursuit full of strange motifs, confusing imagery, saturated colors, and really lush fabrics. So now we'll talk about some quilts. This one comes from the Robert and Artist James collection. And as you can see, the maker has used a log cabin around most of the outside and then pieced the center as a crazy quilt. So both of these would have been foundation pieced, so wouldn't have been a super difficult transition there to the center. So foundation piecing involves the stitching of each individual patchwork piece onto the foundation backing one at a time. And then in the case of a crazy quilt, generally there's also a lot of embroidery and other embellishments added on. So we'll just zoom into the center here. And I apologize in advance for the quality of some of these close-ups. As you all know, we are unable to be in our building right now. And so a lot of these are screenshots of our high-resolution images. So I've pulled as many from my personal collection as I can, but in many cases, they're going to be a little bit blurry. So you can see here some of this really fantastical embroidery that we've been talking about. So crazy quilts also more directly came out of a couple of different trends that were really, really popular at the time. And two of those sprung from the 1876 Philadelphia Centennial Exposition. So one of those was English embroidery with these satin stitches, which give this kind of painterly effect, which you can really see on this bird in the center. And you'll see it on several more quilts as we go through these. You can really see it on the leaves there as well, with that kind of shading, and on the flower also. And then the other is that this was most Americans' first exposure to Japanese art and the Japanese aesthetic, and it really took off. So in some cases, this means kind of copying motifs from Japanese art and architecture. This might be like the crane that you can see, the blue crane up in the top left, fans, beetles, spiders, moths and butterflies, many of which you can see pictured here. But then chinoiserie, this kind of Western interpretation, which is often very stereotypical, if not a downright racist caricature, was really popular. So you can see that in the white block directly below the bird, and then also here toward the right, this guy that the maker has added on here, who is definitely what we would consider today quite a racist stereotype of someone living in Asia. So the next one I want to talk about is this piece, also from the original Robert and Artist James collection. So this one has many elements harkening back to quilts of earlier years. So we've got kind of what you could conceive of as a central medallion. We've got this sashing around the edge, but then there's a true crazy center. But one thing I just want to touch on that we see in a lot of crazy quilts here in the center is the horseshoe, the good luck sign. And I think that's interesting in the ways that superstition ties into all of the other things that are happening culturally right at this time, which we've already been discussing. Now, this is one of my very favorites in the collection. It's in many ways a lot more symmetrical and staid than a lot of crazy quilts, but if you look closely, it has some intensely strange elements that I just love. This one in particular, I feel like this woman on this lithograph, her kind of grim, manic affect just really captures the feeling of the times, and she's bursting through this ribbon as though she wasn't supposed to be there, and she looks both happy and resigned about it. I think she's pretty amazing, and I love that someone chose to put her on a quilt. Similarly, this small child looking kind of bewildered and resigned also makes it onto this quilt. And you can see these incredible detailed tiny decorative stitches all around the outside of the quilt, of the block here. And so I'm not sure exactly what her significance was to this person, but I love that she made it on. Then finally, we do see a lot of owls on crazy quilts, and also this is another great example of that satin stitch that really gives that beautiful painterly effect, that kind of three-dimensional look with that color blending. So owls, of course, probably were meant to symbolize wisdom, and so that's an interesting addition to mix in with the elements we've seen so far, with these kind of superstition and assumptions and guesses about other cultures, and we'll head into some more. So this one, also from the James collection, is a little less of a high style crazy quilt than the others we've looked at. It definitely looks like there are a lot more wools and cottons in this quilt than those really lush silks and velvets, but it is no less interesting. I especially want to highlight here the moon. So we see a lot of moons on crazy quilts, and I don't think that the only reason, although I'm sure it's part of it, is that the moon is an easy shape to create, whether with embroidery or with a piece of fabric to applique on over a seam or something else. So the moon is deeply connected to these ideas of female hysteria and madness. The idea of lunacy or lunatic comes again from the Greeks, and it's this idea that there's a monthly madness that's connected to a cycle based on the moon, which the connection there is pretty clear. So this one is a gift of Lindsay Miller Lerman from our collection, and it's got some really incredible elements as well. If you look closely there, you can see fans, a lot of the flora and fauna that were very popular to put on crazy quilts. Up in the top right, there's a moon again. And then I just wanted to also highlight kind of the extremely irregular piecing. That was really what people were going for. If it looked like it was laid out symmetrically on purpose, that was the opposite of what you wanted. So you can see here that there are just elements laid on top of one another, appliqued on with this just kind of chaos, this density that is confusing and captivating all at once. So this is, I keep saying this, but this is another of my favorites. It's such an odd quilt, and it's, as you can see, embroidered with either the name of the maker or the name of the person it was given to, Maddie Linville, another from the Robert and Artist James collection. And it has some really amazing embroidery elements on it. Another thing about this one, as I'm sure you've noticed in the past several crazy quilts we looked at, it's pretty easy to see, although they are crazy quilts, that they were pieced in blocks. This one, on the other hand, really does look truly crazy, truly random, truly just kind of, there's so much chaos and mayhem in this quilt. It's hard for your eye to settle. It's hard to figure out in what direction it's supposed to go. And so nevertheless, even in a quilt with that much chaos, we return here to the cult of true womanhood with two of our elements, piety and domesticity, captured side by side. Now this one is not from our collection. I have borrowed this image from the Missouri Historical Society, but it's so incredible, and to me, it's just such a crystallization of the absolute weirdness of crazy quilts that I had to include it. So you can see here that there's this really odd, sort of half dead looking, yet blooming with blue and green tree in the center, these two kind of gaping chasms of black behind, and then two halves of a chipmunk, taxidermy chipmunk, and they've embroidered a little acorn for that one of the chipmunks to chew on. And I just think this is such a weird and incredible element, and really speaks to the sort of just absolute strangeness of the time, and in decoration and culturally and socially, that it would be just a relatively normal thing to place a dead animal on the decorative object you wanted to put in your sitting room. So the last one I'll talk about today is one of the most famous quilts in our collection. Many of you are probably familiar with it. It's titled My Crazy Dream, and it was made between 1877 and 1912 by Mary Hernandez Ricard. And this one has so many of the hallmarks of a very, very classic high style crazy quilt. And it's also in beautiful condition. Mary was a milliner, and so I think that's probably why she had access to so many incredible different silks and velvets and various trims, and just a beautiful eye for color. So we'll look a little more closely at this. So again, I really feel like we see this kind of push-pull between these ideals of domesticity and this desire for more independence and freedom. And all of this being overshadowed with male experts pathologizing women's normal emotional and mental experiences. So this little guy here is the Elf King. He is a elf, kind of a Pied Piper figure who steals children. As you can see, he's running away with a toddler. We have no idea why she included that, but I do feel that it speaks to that kind of tension, kind of push-pull between opposite forces happening culturally at the time for women. And this is maybe my favorite part of this quilt. She's got a photolithograph of herself. That is the maker, Mary Hernandez Ricard. And I just love that she put herself on the front of her quilt. That would be a very unusual thing to do even today, but over 100 years ago, it was basically unheard of. And so I love that she is finding her voice and she is finding her autonomy in creating her own crazy quilt. As I mentioned, she worked on this from 1877 to 1912, and so 35 years of work on this quilt. She went over and over all of her seams with more embellishments and more embroidery and more applique, so all of her seams are obscured. You really can't see that it is actually pieced in blocks, but we know that it is because it's unfinished. It was never backed. And so without that, we might have no idea. And also unusually, not only did she sign it, but she gave it a title, My Crazy Dream. And if that's not about the most Freudian name for a quilt, then I don't know what is. So I hope you've all enjoyed this, and make sure you check out our pop-up exhibition that goes along with this. You'll see several of the same quilts you saw today, as well as a couple of bonus quilts.